The 20-win challenge in Clash Royale is about to go underway. If you want a quick synopsis of the top decks to use in this challenge, be sure to check out a video I posted last week, but today we're going to be going super in depth into one single deck. 2.9 Expo. Now, in an attempt to make the guide as comprehensive as possible, I've watched countless Expo videos on YouTube and gotten the help of two pro players. Crafter, a great friend and pro player from Team Non-Meta Musketeers, as well as Air Surfer, a CRL pro from Team Solo Mid. They are both top tier Expo players, so I'll leave both of their Twitters in the description below. Please go check them out if you haven't heard of them already. Now, I realize that what I'm about to go over is a lot of information and it might be a little fast paced, so I'll have timestamps in the pinned comment below for you guys to rewatch any specific part of the video that you want. Anyways, without further ado, let's get right into the ultimate 20-win Expo guide. As with any deck, there are just things that you have to know, and of course, that holds true for the Expo. So in the basics, I'm going to be going over the basic building placements, card counting, and elixir management required for effective Expo play. Building placements. Let's start off with the Expo. Here is the default offensive placement. It's as far outward as possible and one tile from the bridge. This is the Expo placement that I use 9 out of 10 times. This way, it minimizes the range on your opponent's side and allows for a tile to place any defense for the Expo. Now there is the center placement, which is mainly for situations when one of your towers is down, but honestly, I rarely, if ever, will use that placement. Now, when using defensive Expos, there are several different placements depending on what spells your opponents have. Here is the anti-fireball placement. One tile in the opposite lane, 3 tiles from the bridge. Here is the anti-poison and anti-lightning placement. However, this placement is also useful against other matchups as just simply a defensive Expo, as it makes room for a well-placed Tesla on defense. Basically, one corner is touching with the tower. Pretty simple. Now, onto the Tesla. As for offensive Teslas, one big tip I have is to not always support the Expo with the Tesla. It's really easy to overprotect your Expo on offense, and that is a big no-no. But if you're playing Tesla on offense, here are a few good placements. This placement right up against the Expo is for smaller units, such as the Hog or the Balloon. This placement, one tile away from the Expo, is good for pulling tanks as well as bigger units. And finally, this placement behind the Expo is a much more passive play, but it's basically saying, hey, I'm gonna go ahead and give up this Expo for now, but I'll try and outcycle your Expo counter and stack Teslas. Now, onto defensive Teslas. When just playing a Tesla on defense passively, always play it 3 tiles from the bridge. If you play it too far back, units will be able to bypass the Tesla without it popping up, and you don't want that. Now, when a tank is approaching your tower, it is okay to play it 4 tiles back, but again, be very careful that it will pull the troops. Card counting. Now, with Expo, it's super important that you keep count of whether your opponent's biggest Expo counter is in hand. This, in different situations, may be the Royal Giant, an Inferno Tower, a Rocket, or the Golem. You can do this with one simple trick. Once your opponent places a card, they have to play 4 more cards to get back to it. On the flip side, you can take advantage of your fast cycle to outcycle your opponent's Expo counters. Elixir management. Now, I'm not going to go much in depth about elixir management, as I could honestly make an entire guide on this alone. The big point here is to never leak elixir. This is a cycle deck, so instead of leaking that one elixir, you could have just cycled an Ice Spirit to chip the tower. Alright, now that's all I have for the basics. Again, you can always rewatch any section of this video, and if you have any questions, be sure to ask them below. I'll try and reply to as many as I can, but now that I've gone over the basics, let's go over each stage of the match, starting off with the beginning. As with any deck, it's important to have the right start, and for a super matchup dependent deck such as Expo, it actually has a relatively simple start play. Always start off pretty passively by cycling your cheap cards in the back. Since this deck is pretty much all cheap cards, you're guaranteed to have at least one in hand. This can include cycling your archers, skeletons, ice spirit, log, and ice golem to try and force your opponent to make the first real move. Also, try and take as little damage as possible, as Expo is a really long-winded deck that often goes far into overtime, so you want to try and preserve as much tower health as possible in single elixir. Anyway, after the first move, continue playing pretty passively and defend until you determine which matchup you are facing. It's super important that you know what you're facing before you attack a match. For example, if you see Furnace, it'll most likely be Royal Giant. If you see Bandit, it'll most likely be Pekka Control, and if you see Prince, then it's most likely going to be Golem or Giant. Once you've determined the matchup, refer to the next section for a game plan. Expo is a super matchup dependent deck, meaning that how you approach a matchup varies very widely depending on which deck you're facing, so make sure you're fluent in approaching different matchups before hopping into the arena. Golem Beatdown. Oh boy, Golem Beatdown is known to be one of the hardest matchups for Expo, and I mean, it is. This is a matchup that really comes with a ton of practice before mastering, although it's also important to have the correct strategy. Overall, against Golem, you want to play a bit more slowly. Try and break through during single elixir time, because during double elixir, you basically have no chance of connecting an Expo unless they Golem in the back or overextend. Now, there are two situations where you would go with an offensive Expo. The first is if they Golem in the back. I'm sure we all know this, just immediately Expo opposite lane. Pretty simple. If they play a single targeter like Mega Minion onto the Expo, then just use something like skeletons and archers to take it down. If they use a splasher, such as the Baby Dragon, I would just ignore it. Now, the second situation where you would go Expo opposite lane is if your opponent places something 4 elixir or greater in the back. This way, your opponent actually will not have the elixir to play the Golem by the time the Expo loads up, and will actually be forced to play something else to respond, completely breaking down their Golem push. Now, another big aspect of this deck is to try and outcycle your opponent's Golem. If you've just landed a good defense or push, keep up the pressure with another Expo. Now, let's talk about defending a Golem push. So, Golem in the back. First thing you probably want to do if your Expo isn't in hand is to place a Tesla 4 tiles from the bridge. This way, you will actually be able to cycle to a second Tesla. If your opponent has Night Witch, go ahead and Fireball and log it out. Then, place your archers in the back far corner. Then, once the Golem approaches your side, get an Ice Golem down. This should destroy the bats and kite units towards the Tesla. By then, you should be back to a second Tesla, and you can play it down if you need it. You should also be back to a second Fireball if needed as well. Royal Giant. Royal Giant is another one of those counter decks, so oftentimes you're probably just trying to draw the match. So when you start off, cycling your cards in the back and you see Furnace, E-Wiz, Mega Minion, or Baby Dragon, it's quite likely that you're going to be facing the Royal Giant. So with the Expo, you really just want to play more defensively the entire match. If you offensive Expo at the wrong time, then you're pretty much screwed. Now, during the match, however, that doesn't mean you neglect trying to get chip damage. You should be fireballing Electro Wizards, Furnaces, and getting chip damage with your logs and archers, as you never know when you could get an Expo lock onto the tower, especially if your opponent overcommits. However, it's important to only fireball if you're not super behind in elixir. Be very careful not to be too aggressive with your spells, or else you're gonna pay for it. Again, keep in mind that Royal Giant users are probably running Lightning, so use a anti-lightning placement. Now, on to defending a Royal Giant push, because this one's also pretty difficult. So, when the Royal Giant is coming down the lane, go with a defensive Expo in that anti-lightning spot. Now, there are two options you can defend. The first is to go with a Tesla near the tower, with archers far out to avoid the spell value. The second way to defend is to go archers in the back with a high Tesla. Again, trying to avoid spell value. Also, Fireball can be super clutch on defense as well. Now, at this point, you do also have to make an important decision. If you manage to get quite a bit of damage in single elixir, you can try and spell cycle the opponent out. If not, then go for a draw, because there is almost no way for you to break through with your Expo in double elixir or overtime. Giant Beatdown. Giant Beatdown is also a pretty hard counter to the Expo, so as an Expo user, you'll have to be super meticulous to win this matchup. During single elixir, if they giant in the back, obviously go with the Expo opposite lane. You can spend some elixir defending what they place to take out your Expo, but then focus on defending the giant push with your Tesla, skeletons, archers, and all your kiting units. Now, one thing I really like to do against giant matchups is to Expo even if they have the giant in hand. If they giant same lane with the Expo, you might want to give up on the Expo. This time, play a Tesla in this position, let it DPS down the Expo, and try to outcycle your opponent's giant. You can even get a second Tesla down if you manage your elixir well enough. Pekka Ram. Pekka Ram is another relatively hard matchup, but once you get the matchup down, you should be able to win pretty consistently. Now, the key with this deck is two things: saving your Tesla for the Ram Rider and setting up defensive Expos. Also, 9 out of 10 times your opponent will have poison, so be sure to place your defensive Expos in the anti-poison spot in the opposite lane your opponent is attacking in. Now against Pekka, again, start off rather passively, using all of your cycle cards to take care of small pushes and fireballing the tower for any sort of value. Now, about halfway through the match, go ahead and put down a defensive Expo after you've just defended a push. Ideally, you will have baited out a poison spell, but either way, get that defensive Expo down and be sure to protect it. This way, any push your opponent mounts will just be feeding elixir into that Expo to chop up. Then, after another successful defense with the defensive Expo up, you can go in with an offensive Expo Tesla push. If your opponent manages to counter it or has Pekka in cycle, don't fret. You can either outcycle that Pekka and go right back into another Expo, or you can reset with another defensive Expo and rinse and repeat. Mega Knight. A Mega Knight matchup is really similar to a Pekka one, but if the opponent has an Inferno Dragon, then it's probably a Mega Knight deck, most likely with the Ram Rider as well. Now, against this matchup, you want to play it really similar to a Pekka matchup, with the defensive Expos and all that stuff. In my opinion, it's quite a bit harder than the Pekka matchup, since the Mega Knight jump can just absolutely shred our deck, but again, just be sure to take fireball value with the tower. This means fireballing Inferno Dragons or E-Wizzes with the tower when possible. Mega Knight is a lot harder of a deck to break through with Expo, so oftentimes this matchup will run long into overtime. Lava Hound. For the most part, I don't find Lava Hound matchups that difficult. Start as usual, just be sure to have something such as Ice Golem to tank 4 baby dragons. When your opponent places a Lava Hound in the back, immediately Expo in the same lane. This way, you try and avoid any chance for an opposite lane tower trade. If they play Skeleton Army or Guards, go ahead and log them out, and if they play a Lumberjack, Skeletons and Ice Spirit will do. If your opponent uses a Flying Machine, immediately fireball that out as well. Now, the biggest reason why I like to go same lane is because support troops will often go around the Lava Hound. This allows you to use a strategic Tesla placement to take care of support units first before working on the Lava Hound. Also, try to also have an Ice Golem in cycle. It's super important to try and preserve as much health on that Tesla as possible, that way the Tesla can just shred on defense. Now, against Lava Clone, your opponent will have no big spell, so you don't really have to worry about your archers dying. Against a Lava Hound deck with poison, it's a little more tricky, but as long as you space out your units a little bit more, you should be just fine. Mirror Match. Ah, the dreaded mirror match. So, against mirror matches, I usually like to start off rather passively in single elixir time. When they go in with the Expo, distract it with the Ice Golem, and then just fireball it with the Arena Tower, log if needed, and then place archers on the side to take it down completely. In double elixir time, you can really start ramping up the heat and play a bit more aggressively with your Expos, being sure to protect it either with a Tesla or an Ice Golem. If they decide to defensive Expo, just place something such as an Ice Golem to block for the Expo's shots. On the flip side, if you decide to place a defensive Expo yourself, obviously place it in the anti-fireball position first, and also place something such as an Ice Golem to protect it, so your opponent's Expo doesn't shred yours. Again, keep something in your hand to block your opponent's Expos at all times. Finally, also be smart with your spells. Log can be super valuable against the Expo as well as archers, and Fireball and Tesla will be your main damage against your opponent's Expo. Mortar Bait. Now, Mortar Bait is another one of those quite iffy matchups. Again, just start passively cycling and wait for the opponent to make the first big move. If they go with the mortar, you would obviously place something in the center to block. Ideally, you would place an ice golem in the opposite lane, wait for the mortar to lock onto the ice golem, then utilize archers or a Tesla to take the mortar down. After defending a push, if your opponent spent a lot of elixir, then immediately Expo opposite lane. I find that going opposite lane is a lot more successful against Mortar Bait, as it forces your opponent to split their damage on the towers. Now, if your opponent decides to defensive mortar, then just defensive Expo, making sure you place it in the anti-fireball position. Now, another thing you should be very careful about is taking too much damage from the miner. The miner can be a sneakily lethal card, so be sure to use something such as Ice Spear or Skeletons to try and DPS him down. Fireball Bait. Now, this deck is a relatively new deck in the meta, but it's also not a very difficult matchup. Just start off again pretty passively. Try and get your opponent to make the first Royal Hog push and use Tesla to defend that, because keep in mind that if you don't use the Fireball on these Hogs, you'll have them on offense. Also, defensive Expos can also be quite useful against Zappies or the Magic Archer. As usual, after a pretty successful defense, you'll be able to set up an Expo at the bridge. Tesla obviously shreds up all of his defensive troops, and once you get an offense going, be careful not to over-defend the Expo. Instead, manage your cycle and try and cycle back to another one. Again, it's super important to be smart with your fireballs, but with your fast cycle, I don't find too much trouble answering all the spam. Hog. Now, while Hog isn't exactly an easy matchup, it's not exactly a hard one either. Most Hog decks that you will face are going to be 2.6 matchups, or at least some sort of fast cycle. So keep in mind that for the most part, they will be able to keep up with your cycle. For me, I find that you can go same lane or opposite lane, either way works. Now, probably the most important thing about this matchup is to keep the Tesla in your hand for that Hog on defense at the start of the match. You have to use your cheap cycle, or else your opponent will actually manage to outcycle your Tesla. Also, be sure to fireball, any decent value with the tower, and once you're able to defend a few Hog pushes successfully, or if your opponent overcommits, immediately Expo after a defense. You can also place an offensive Tesla too if you're really confident. With Hog decks, they have no way to reset your Expo once it locks onto the tower, so oftentimes just one lock can be lethal. Alright, now that we've gone over how to face some of the most popular decks in this meta, let's go ahead and dive into the endgame.
We're in the endgame now.
Okay, you've determined the matchup and the game timer is slowly winding down towards overtime. Congratulations, you're hopefully in a relatively good situation. But either way, with any deck, it's also important to know how to attack a game as you approach the end of a match. With Expo, there are 3 ways to do so. Continue doing what you're doing, go for a draw, or spell cycle. Let's take a look at each one. Expo lock. So you're into double elixir time, approaching overtime now. How do you play? Well, for the most part, just continue the strategies according to the matchups I showed earlier. After all, oftentimes, one Expo lock will be enough to bring the tower down pretty low, down to spell cycle range. This is generally what you will do for most easy to medium matchups. Just keep doing what you've been doing and try and break through. Again, all you need to do in the endgame is to bring that tower down to spell cycle range. Draws. On the flip side, if you aren't able to break through at all by the start of overtime, it may be time to consider going for a draw, especially against a difficult matchup such as Royal Giant, Golem, or Giant Beatdown. In this case, it's still okay to play offensive Expos, but again, do not overextend on offense. Defensive Expos are always key in draws, so be sure to use those effectively. Again, refer to each of the matchups for more detailed information on how to play each matchup. Spell cycling. Spell cycling is a really important part of 2.9, especially to finish off matches. So, when should we do it? Well, I usually recommend spell cycling when you've already taken the tower somewhat low, at about around half health, when you just can't seem to break through when you're around double elixir. Now, with Expo, it's often better to just log cycle. After all, log is a super cheap and relatively inconsequential card to cycle and won't be that big of a commitment. Now, of course, if you can get fireball value against a tower, then definitely take it, but for the most part, I wouldn't recommend just straight out fireball cycling until you are just 2 fireballs away. Fireball cycling is a pretty huge commitment, and it not only is a waste of 4 elixir, but it's also a waste of a super valuable defensive card, so be careful about deciding when to fireball cycle. At tournament standard, 2 fireballs and 2 logs do 570 damage, so be sure to remember that number. Well, there we go. This marks the end of the 2.9 Expo guide. I really hope that this video at least helped you with your comprehension and theory of how to play the 2.9 Expo. And as I always say, it's often about the player and not the deck, so be sure to practice, and practice. After all, knowing how to approach matchups is only half the battle. You have to actually be able to do it. So go ahead, just jump into a few classic challenges and see if you can implement some of these tips. I know this is a lot of information to process, so again, timestamps will be in the pinned comment, and be sure to ask any questions you have in the comment section below. But unfortunately, guys, that's all I've got time for in today's video. If you enjoyed, please leave a like down below, as well as a subscription to my channel. And as always, this is Legendaray, and I'm signing off. See you guys next time.